Hello everyone, this is the lesson on the start of war in Asia Pacific. As you can recall, your Sec 2 syllabus, Singapore was invaded by Japanese in 1942. It was occupied till 1945. There were many atrocities, there were many suffering. Now, um, this story of Singapore's invasion is part of the overall development of war in Asia Pacific. So in this lesson, we will look at how the war started and why the war started. Basically, the war started on 7 and 8 December 1941, depending on the time zone, when the Japanese simultaneously invaded the east coast of Malaya, southern Thailand, and Pearl Harbor in USA. Now, the main purpose of this war is to grab land and resources from Southeast Asia. And this is the conflict that involved Singapore very soon after December 1941. Now, the above actions, right, put Japan at war with USA because it has attacked Pearl Harbor, Britain because it attacked Malaya and later subsequently Singapore, the Netherlands because after Singapore the Japanese attacked the Dutch East Indies, which is also known as Indonesia today, and subsequently it wishes to conquer Australia. Now the war ended after the Japanese dropped two atomic bombs on Japan in 1945. Okay, so what is the reason? What brought the Japanese to do all this? All right, December 1941, the invasion of Malaya and the attack on Pearl Harbor. What were the reasons? Basically, four main points. The first one is crisis in Japan. The second one is Japanese expansionist foreign policy. Think about Hitler. It's quite similar. The third will be the weakness of the League of Nations, very similar to the Hitler chapter. And Japan's response to world developments, right? Development by USA as well as developments in Europe due to the war in Europe. Whereas the Asia Pacific, we are in the Asia Pacific, Singapore right here, all right? We are part of Asia and we are connected, all right, to the other continents via the Pacific Ocean. So this is the Asia Pacific region. You have Japan, China, you have the French Indochina, which is Vietnam today, and you have Malaysia, you have Singapore, you have Philippines, so on and so forth. Alright, let's start with the first factor to the start of war in Asia Pacific. The Japanese were facing economic crisis in the 20s and the 30s. Basically, they had a rapid population growth, and as a result, there were shortage of land for farming. Now, the Japanese did not invest in modern equipment for farming. They were not like Stalin, and as a result, when the population grew, the shortage of land basically exacerbated their crisis. Um, Furthermore, in 1929, you have the Great Depression, with US and Britain and a lot of other Western countries becoming poor as a result of the Great Depression. They imposed a trade restriction and taxation on goods from Japan. Now, resulting in a reduction in Japanese goods, therefore exacerbating the economic crisis. Now, at the same time, you have the Japanese government taking over by the military, which we will talk in a short while. With the economic crisis, the Japanese felt that they need an economic solution that involved them invading foreign lands to grab their resources to solve their problems. Overpopulation, as we have talked about, um, you know, is a big problem in Japan because it results in a significant demand for housing, for goods and products, which the Japanese couldn't have gotten, all right, without invading other country. Because if you look at the geography of Japan, it is basically a small island archipelago. So the Japanese need more land to feed itself and to house the people. It felt that an appropriate measure to solve this crisis is to acquire more overseas territories. And you may think that that is evil, that's uncalled for. It is by today's standard. But think about it, in the 20s, the 30s, many of the Western powers did enrich themselves by occupying overseas territories. The Japanese felt that they should be entitled to enrich themselves via the same way as well. You have not only an economic crisis in Japan, but also a political crisis. You have the Japanese Prime Minister assassinated in 1932, and parliamentary rule in Japan therefore ended. It was taken over by martial law, in other words, military rule. So you have the military taking over the government. Now, and what do military people know best? They know war, alright? And they see that war, conquest, is a possible solution to end their other crisis, alright? Namely the Japanese crisis. So as a result of that, the Japanese embark on an expansionist policy. The expansionist policy here means that they choose to expand overseas, right, to get resources such as oil. Okay? Part of the reason why they want to do that, not only as a means to solve their problem, is they want to be seen as equal to the other world powers. As mentioned just now, it was in a period of time where grabbing resources overseas, taking land from people overseas is a justifiable act. The British did that in Malaya, in India, so on and so forth. The French did that in Indochina, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. To an extent, the Americans in Philippines. So the Japanese being run by the military at this time want Japan to be seen as equal to the other colonial powers. They saw that, acquiring resources overseas is a legitimate and normal act of foreign policy. Specifically, they plan to create the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. Alright, basically, that involved them dominating East Asia and Southeast Asia, expelling the Western colonial powers, and then allow the Japanese to gain all these territories for their own economic gains. Of course, you will know that the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere is basically a propaganda statement, right? Co-prosperity is subordinated to their true intention, and that is to enrich themselves. Now, one of the early act of expansion is the invasion of Manchuria, and Manchuria is this land over here in China that is quite close to Korea, which they already have occupied. Now, to seize control of Manchuria, they need an excuse, and basically in 1931, a train carrying Japanese passengers outside Mukden in Manchuria exploded. Now the Japanese therefore quickly blame it on Chinese nationalists, and Japanese soldiers therefore invaded Manchuria, and 6 months later, with the excuse of protecting Japanese interests, because suddenly Manchuria became very dangerous for the Japanese, and therefore they sought to protect their own interests there. Now we would know that this is all an excuse, because if you look at the picture over here, this is the post event photo of the bomb attack. You could hardly see any any damage. It is a small bomb. Alright, but the Japanese took that as an excuse to invade Manchuria. Of course, the Chinese were not happy about that. They reported to the LON. LON went down to investigate the scene, and as a result of that, you have the Lighten report being created to say that the Japanese army has acted in a way that's beyond self-defense. Basically, the Japanese army was expansionist, was aggressive. The LN wanted to raise a motion to condemn Japan. However, as you know, the LN was weak. The Japanese delegation therefore just walked out and then withdraw from the LN. They couldn't do anything. Now, As you know from the Hitler's chapter, because LN couldn't do anything, the Japanese became emboldened and then therefore sought to uh, invade more of China. And that is what they did. In July 1937, the Japanese troops were having an exercise um, near the Marco Polo Bridge at the city of Wanping, and they fired at it. The Chinese troops therefore fired back in response, in return. Later on, the Japanese discovered that one of their soldiers went missing. They believed that the Chinese have captured that Japanese soldier. The Japanese therefore demand entry into Wanping, and then after many attempts to force their way into Wanping, the Japanese launched a full-scale invasion of China. China appealed to LN for help, and as you know, LN was weak. It was too occupied by Hitler's expansionist policy. Their assistance was delayed. As a result of the Second Sino-Japanese War, which is the invasion after the Marco Polo Bridge incident, the Japanese controlled quite a huge stretch of land in China, right, in the hope of drawing resources from there. In the process of doing that, the Japanese also conducted immense atrocities, right? One of it is the massacre in Nanking, the former capital of China. In response to that, the Americans therefore decided to place restriction, alright, think about economic sanction, alright, on Japan. They basically banned the export of steel, scrap iron, and very importantly, fuel to Japan, making it difficult for Japan to continue their war effort in China. Now, this put Japan in a very desperate situation because Japan is a small archipelago state. It does not have fuel, and if you do not have oil, petroleum, your basically everything crumbles. Your industry stop, your military stop. So the Japanese became more desperate and therefore were attracted to oil-rich places in Southeast Asia, namely in the Dutch East Indies. Now, the Japanese were attracted to Southeast Asia after the embargo by USA. It is also because they knew that if they were to expand into Southeast Asia, they would face very little resistance because the Western powers, right, think about the British, the Dutch, and then the French, they were all busy fighting, or they have already have fallen to Hitler during the war, and this is the period where they had the war in Europe. So it therefore made it even more attractive, alright, to enter Southeast Asia to seize the important resources, including and not limited to oil, petroleum. Now, to do that, the Japanese knew that they have to target US naval forces in the Pacific, basically the US Pacific Fleet that is, birthed in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. They had to target it because they were afraid that if the fleet is around, America would intervene when they invaded Southeast Asia. Now, how they know that the Americans would intervene? Because the Americans had already issued an economic sanction on Japan. That shows that the Americans are not restrained in being hostile towards Japan if necessary. So simultaneously as the Japanese invaded Southeast Asia, like Malaya, on the same day the Japanese sent warplanes to destroy the fleet at Pearl Harbor, hoping that with the fleet being destroyed, the Americans would not intervene and the Americans may even sue for peace with Japan. However, as you know, that is wishful thinking. If you attack a sleeping giant, the giant will wake up feeling angry and declare war back on Japan, and that is what happened. Alright, the Americans didn't sue for peace, declare war on Japan. After the attack on Malaya, Britain declared war on Japan, and that is the start of World War II in Asia Pacific. So basically, there are four main points: crisis in Japan, Japanese expansionist policy, weakness of LON, and Japan response to world developments. Alright, study this chapter and see you next time. Thank you.